The desert wind carried dust and desperation through the streets of Copper Ridge that October morning in 1885, but nothing could have prepared the gathered crowd for what they were about to witness. A young widow, clutching $3 silver with trembling hands, was about to make a purchase that would change 2 lives forever. What started as an act of unexpected mercy would become a love story that defied every rule the Arizona Territory had ever known. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach lurched to a halt outside Rodriguez Trading Post, sending up a cloud of red dust that caught the morning sun like ground rubies. Sarah Mitchell stepped down carefully, her black mourning dress already wilted from the desert heat, her face pale beneath the wide brim of her bonnet. She carried a single carpetbag and a leather pouch containing everything she had left in the world: $14.37, a wedding ring she couldn't bear to wear, and a deed to a worthless mining claim her dead husband had won in a card game 3 months before an Apache arrow found his heart. The driver tossed her bag to the dusty ground without ceremony. "This is as far as the line goes, ma'am." "You sure about this place?" "Ain't nothing here but rocks and rattlesnakes." Sarah nodded, though her throat felt too dry to speak. Copper Ridge stretched before her like a fever dream, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts baking under the merciless Arizona sun, surrounded by red canyon walls that rose like the walls of some ancient prison. The town seemed to shimmer in the heat, and she wondered if it might disappear entirely if she blinked too hard. "Mrs. Mitchell?" A woman's voice, accented with the warm cadence of Mexico, called from the trading post doorway. Elena Rodriguez emerged, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She was a sturdy woman with kind eyes and silver threads in her black hair. "I received your letter. Come inside before you melt like butter." The interior of the trading post was blessedly cool, filled with the mingled scents of leather, coffee, and dried chiles hanging in scarlet ropes from the ceiling beams. Elena bustled about, pouring water from a clay pitcher into a tin cup. "You drink. The desert, she takes the water from you without asking permission." Sarah accepted the cup gratefully, her hand still shaking slightly. "Thank you. I wasn't sure anyone would receive my letter. Letters find their way, even out here. You said your husband left you the Esperanza claim?" Elena's expression grew troubled. "Senora, I must tell you the truth, that mine has been worked by 3 different men. All of them found nothing but empty rock. Your husband, God rest his soul, he was not the first to believe in fool's gold." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she'd learned to absorb disappointment without flinching. Her late husband Robert had been full of grand schemes and empty promises, right up until the day he rode out with a cavalry unit to teach the savages a lesson and never came home. "I have nowhere else to go," she said simply. "Perhaps I can find work in town." Elena's expression softened further. "There is work, but—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "This is a hard place for a woman alone, especially one from back east. The men here, they are rough. And there are complications you should know about." Before Elena could explain further, the sound of shouting erupted from the street outside. Both women moved to the window, peering through the dusty glass. A crowd had gathered in the town square, forming a rough circle around a wooden platform that hadn't been there when Sarah arrived. Men in worn work clothes and dusty hats jostled for position, their voices rising in excitement and cruelty. "What's happening?" Sarah asked. Elena's face darkened. "Something that should not happen in a Christian town. But Colonel Whitmore, he has different ideas about justice." She spat into the dust. "Come away from the window, Senora. This is not for gentle eyes." But Sarah found herself unable to look away. On the platform stood 3 figures: 2 men. in military uniforms, and a third man who made her breath catch in her throat. He was tall and powerfully built, his bronze skin marked by scars that told stories of violence and survival. His long black hair hung loose around his shoulders, and most shocking of all, his eyes were covered by a strip of dirty cloth tied tightly around his head. Colonel James Whitmore, a man whose gray whiskers couldn't soften the hardness around his pale eyes, stepped forward and raised his voice above the crowd. "Gentlemen of Copper Ridge, we have here a specimen of the Apache menace that has plagued our territory. This savage was captured during the recent troubles near Fort Verde. Rather than waste the taxpayers' money keeping him in irons, we're offering him for legitimate labor contracts." Sarah pressed closer to the window, her heart racing. "They're selling him like property." "The colonel, he calls it redemptive labor," Elena said bitterly. "But we know what it really is, slavery with different words." On the platform, the bound man stood perfectly still, his head held high despite the cloth over his eyes. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the defiance in his posture, the way he refused to bow his head or cower before the jeering crowd. Fresh cuts and bruises marked his arms and chest, evidence of recent mistreatment, but he showed no sign of pain or fear. "Now then," Colonel Whitmore continued, "who'll start the bidding? This specimen is strong as an ox and twice as stubborn. Perfect for mining work, ditch digging, or any labor that requires a strong back and a broken spirit. We'll start at $10 for a 1-year contract. $5. Someone called from the crowd. "7, shouted another. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Sarah watched in growing horror as the men bid back and forth, haggling over a human being as if he were livestock. The bound man's jaw tightened with each bid, but he remained silent and motionless. There was something magnificent about his dignity in the face of such degradation, something that reminded Sarah of a caged eagle that refused to stop looking toward the sky. The bidding continued, climbing slowly toward $8. Sarah found herself studying the prisoner more closely. Despite his bonds and blindfold, despite the humiliation of being displayed like an animal, he carried himself with an unmistakable nobility. This was no ordinary man. This was a warrior who had seen battle and faced death without flinching. $8.50. Called Frank Crawford, the deputy marshal whose reputation for cruelty was known throughout the territory. "I could use a strong back for my ranch, and I know how to handle difficult animals." The crowd laughed at Crawford's words, and Sarah saw the prisoner's hands clench into fists behind his back. Even she could hear the implied threat in the deputy's tone. Colonel Whitmore nodded approvingly. $8.50 from Deputy Crawford. "Do I hear 9? The square fell quiet. Sarah realized that most of the men present couldn't afford to bid higher, and those who could were probably reconsidering the wisdom of taking on what they clearly saw as a dangerous prisoner. Crawford grinned smugly, already counting his victory. "Going once," Whitmore called. Something inside Sarah snapped. Perhaps it was the memory of her own helplessness when Robert died and left her with nothing but debts and false promises. Perhaps it was the way the prisoner maintained his dignity despite everything being done to him. Or perhaps it was simply that she recognized a fellow survivor when she saw one. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Sarah pushed open the trading post door and stepped into the blazing sunlight of the square. $9. She called out, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. Every head in the crowd turned toward her, and the weight of their stares felt like a physical force. She'd never spoken in public before, never drawn attention to herself, but something about the prisoner's stoic courage gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Colonel Whitmore blinked in surprise. "Ma'am, I don't believe we've been introduced. Are you certain you understand what you're bidding on?" "I understand perfectly, Colonel. $9 for a 1-year labor contract." Sarah stepped closer. to the platform, her chin raised defiantly. Behind her, she could hear Elena whispering urgent prayers in Spanish. Deputy Crawford's face flushed red with anger. "Now hold on just a minute. That's no work for a lady. This savage is dangerous. He killed 3 of our boys before we brought him down." $10, Sarah said firmly, ignoring Crawford's protest. She reached into her leather pouch and withdrew 10 of her precious silver dollars, holding them high for all to see. The coins caught the sunlight and gleamed like stars. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. A woman, a widow in mourning dress, no less, had just outbid the deputy marshal for a captured warrior. It was scandalous. It was unthinkable. It was the most exciting thing that had happened in Copper Ridge since the silver mine played out. Crawford sputtered with rage. $11. But Sarah could see the uncertainty in his eyes. $11 was more than most men in Copper Ridge made in 2 weeks. She took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. $15, she said quietly. The square went dead silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. $15 was a fortune in a town like Copper Ridge, more money than most people saw in a month. Every face in the crowd turned from Sarah to Crawford, waiting to see if the deputy would match such an outrageous bid. Crawford opened his mouth, then closed it again. His face cycled through red, purple, and finally a sickly pale green. $15 was more than he could afford, especially for what amounted to a very expensive way to indulge his sadistic impulses. Colonel Whitmore cleared his throat, clearly taken aback by the turn of events. $15 from the lady. Do I hear 16? Silence stretched across the square like a taut rope. Sarah could feel sweat trickling down her back, though whether from the heat or her own terror, she couldn't say. She'd just spent nearly all her remaining money on a man she'd never met, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain even to herself. On the platform, the prisoner had turned his head slightly in her direction, as if trying to understand who had spoken. Even blindfolded, he seemed to sense that something unexpected was happening. "Going once," Whitmore called. "Going twice." He paused, giving Crawford one last chance to speak up. When the deputy remained silent, his face twisted with frustrated rage, the colonel brought down his gavel with a sharp crack. "Sold to the lady for $15. The crowd exploded into chatter and speculation. A widow buying a dangerous Apache warrior? What could she possibly be thinking? Some of the men looked at Sarah with newfound respect, others with obvious suspicion. A few shook their heads and walked away, muttering about the moral decay of modern society. Sarah approached the platform on unsteady legs, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Up close, the prisoner was even more imposing, easily 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the lean, hard muscle of a man who'd spent his life fighting and surviving. The scars on his chest and arms formed an intricate map of violence survived and battles won. Despite everything, despite the bonds and the blindfold and the humiliation, he radiated a quiet power that made the air around him seem to vibrate. Colonel Whitmore stepped down from the platform to meet her, his expression a mixture of confusion and barely concealed disapproval. "Ma'am, I feel obligated to warn you one more time. This prisoner is extremely dangerous. He's killed soldiers, burned homesteads, and led raids across the territory. Are you absolutely certain you want to take responsibility for him?" Sarah looked up at the bound man, studying the proud set of his shoulders and the way he held his head despite being unable to see. Something about him called to a part of her soul she'd thought had died with Robert, not the romantic part, but the part that recognized strength and honor when it saw them. "I'm certain," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Whitmore shrugged and held out his hand. $15 then, and he's your problem. But don't come crying to us when he scalps you in your sleep." Sarah counted out the silver dollars into the colonel's palm, watching her financial security disappear coin by coin. When the last dollar clinked against the others, she felt simultaneously terrified and strangely liberated. She'd just made the most impulsive, possibly foolish decision of her entire life. "There are conditions," Whitmore continued, producing a folded paper from his coat. "The contract specifies that the prisoner must remain within the town limits unless accompanied by proper authority. Any attempt to escape will be met with immediate recapture and execution. The contractor, that's you, ma'am, is personally responsible for any damages or crimes committed by the prisoner during the term of service." Sarah nodded, barely listening to the legal language. Her attention was fixed on the man who now, apparently, belonged to her in some legal sense that made her stomach turn. As if sensing her gaze, he turned his head again in her direction, and she caught a glimpse of bronze skin beneath the edge of the blindfold. "Shall we remove his restraints?" one of the soldiers asked. "Not the blindfold," Crawford interjected quickly. "Apache eyes are dangerous. They can curse a person just by looking at them." Several people in the crowd nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense. Sarah stared at Crawford in disgust. "That's ridiculous superstition." "Ma'am, I strongly advise you to leave the blindfold in place," Colonel Whitmore said firmly. "At least until you've established proper control over the prisoner. Apache warriors are known for their hypnotic powers." More racist nonsense, Sarah thought, but she was too overwhelmed to argue further. The soldiers untied the rope's binding the prisoner's hands, and she saw him flex his fingers carefully, working circulation back into them. Even this simple movement was performed with controlled grace, like a dangerous animal testing its bonds. "What's his name?" Sarah asked. Whitmore shrugged. "We call him Prisoner 47. His savage name is unpronounceable." The bound man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that he understood English and was listening to every word. Sarah felt another surge of anger at the casual dehumanization, but she held her tongue. She'd already made enough enemies for one day. "Come with me," she said quietly to the prisoner, though she had no idea if he could understand her or would obey if he could. To her surprise, he turned toward the sound of her voice and took a step in her direction. His movements were careful but confident, like someone who'd learned to navigate the world by senses other than sight. The crowd parted reluctantly as Sarah led her new responsibility away from the platform. She could feel their stares boring into her back, could hear the whispered speculation and dire predictions following in her wake. Elena Rodriguez appeared at her side like a guardian angel, taking Sarah's arm and guiding both her and the prisoner toward the trading post. "Dios mío," Elena murmured under her breath. "What have you done, child?" Sarah looked back at the tall man walking silently behind them, his dignity intact despite everything that had been done to him, and realized she had absolutely no idea. She'd spent nearly all her money on a man she couldn't communicate with, who might very well hate her for participating in his humiliation, and who represented everything the frontier town of Copper Ridge feared and despised. But as they walked toward the uncertain future awaiting them, Sarah found herself thinking about the way he'd refused to bow his head on the platform, the quiet strength that radiated from him even in chains, and the strange sense of recognition she'd felt when she first saw him. Perhaps, she thought with a mixture of terror and hope, they were both exactly where they needed to be. The interior of Rodriguez Trading Post felt like a sanctuary after the blazing hostility of the town square, but Sarah quickly realized that sanctuary was an illusion. No sooner had Elena closed the door behind them than the whispers began outside. Voices carrying through the thin adobe walls like poison seeping through cracks. "She's lost her mind completely," came Martha Stevens' shrill voice. Martha ran the town's only boarding house and considered herself the unofficial keeper of Copper Ridge's moral standards, buying that savage like he was a prize bull at auction. "Mark my words, we'll all be murdered in our beds before the week is out." Maybe that's what she wants, replied another voice Sarah recognized as belonging to Henry Walsh, who owned the largest general store in town. Heard tell her husband left her with nothing but debts and that worthless mine claim. Perhaps she figures if the Apache kills her, she won't have to face the shame of poverty. Elena's face flushed with anger, and she moved toward the door as if to confront the gossips, but Sarah caught her arm. Please don't, it will only make things worse. The prisoner stood motionless near the center of the room, his head tilted slightly as he listened to the voices outside. Even blindfolded, he seemed to understand exactly what was being said about him. Sarah watched the muscles in his jaw tense and release, the only outward sign of whatever emotions were churning beneath his stoic exterior. They speak of me as if I am already dead, he said suddenly, his voice deep and resonant despite the obvious effort it cost him to speak. The words were heavily accented but perfectly clear, each syllable carefully formed. In their mind's eye, ceased to be human the moment they put chains on my wrists. Sarah started in surprise. After an hour of watching him stand silent and seemingly uncomprehending, she'd begun to wonder if he spoke English at all. You understand everything they're saying. I understand more than they realize, he replied, turning his head toward her voice. I know that you are a widow named Sarah Mitchell. I know that you spent nearly all your money to purchase my contract. I know that your husband was killed during a cavalry raid, and that you have come here with nothing but hope and desperation. Elena crossed herself and muttered something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. The intimate details of her life were apparently common knowledge throughout Copper Ridge, discussed as casually as the weather or the price of grain. How do you know all that? Sarah asked. People speak freely around prisoners, especially ones they believe cannot understand them, he said. Your Colonel Whitmore was quite thorough in explaining your circumstances to his men while I stood on that platform. He seemed to find great amusement in the idea that a desperate widow might be foolish enough to bid on damaged goods. The casual cruelty of Whitmore's words, filtered through this man's measured recounting, hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on her own act of defiance that she hadn't considered how thoroughly she'd been humiliated in the process. The entire town now saw her as either pitifully naive or dangerously unhinged. Outside, the voices grew louder and more heated. Pastor William Hayes had apparently joined the crowd, his sonorous preacher's voice rising above the others. This is what comes of allowing women to make decisions beyond their natural sphere. The weaker sex is easily swayed by sentiment and emotion, unable to see the larger dangers their foolishness might unleash upon the community. Perhaps we should speak to the colonel about voiding the contract, suggested Dr. Benjamin Clark, whose medical practice made him one of the more influential voices in town. Surely a woman cannot be held legally responsible for such an obviously irrational decision. It's clear she's suffering from hysteria brought on by her recent bereavement. Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Hysteria, the convenient diagnosis that allowed men to dismiss any female action they disapproved of as temporary madness. She'd heard the word whispered about her often enough since Robert's death, usually followed by suggestions that she needed a firm masculine hand to guide her back to proper feminine behavior. They want to take you away from me, the prisoner observed quietly. They believe you lack the capacity to make rational decisions. Do you believe that? Sarah asked, surprised by her own boldness in asking the question. He was quiet for a long moment, his head tilted as if considering not just her words, but the tone in which she'd spoken them. I believe, he said finally, that you are the first person in this town to see me as something other than a dangerous animal. Whether that makes you rational or foolish, I cannot say, but it makes you different. Elena had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. Now she stepped forward, studying the prisoner with renewed interest. What is your real name? She asked in Spanish. He turned toward her, a slight smile touching the corners of his mouth. Hastian Bejish, he replied in the same language. Though most white men find it easier to call me Thomas. Thomas Yazzie, Alina said thoughtfully. I have heard this name before. My late husband's brother traded with your people sometimes, before the troubles grew too bad. He spoke of a war chief who fought with great honor, who protected his people even when it meant certain death. Thomas's shoulders straightened, almost imperceptibly. Your husband's brother was a good man. He never cheated us on the price of silver, and he never betrayed the location of our camps to the soldiers. Sarah listened to this exchange with growing fascination. Here was a man who spoke at least 3 languages, who was remembered with respect by people who had known him before his capture, who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. How had he ended up bound and blindfolded on an auction platform in Copper Ridge? Before she could ask, the voices outside reached a new crescendo of outrage. Deputy Crawford's voice cut through the others like a rusty blade. I don't care what contract that woman thinks she signed. That savage belongs in chains, not wandering free in a Christian town. If something happens, if he kills someone or burns down a building, the blood will be on all our hands for allowing this madness to continue. What do you propose we do? Pastor Hayes asked. Simple, Crawford replied. We declare the woman mentally incompetent and transfer the prisoner to proper authority. I'll take responsibility for him. Make sure he's put to appropriate use. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. She'd heard enough stories about Crawford's treatment of prisoners to know that appropriate use would likely involve torture, degradation, and eventual death. The deputy had a reputation for cruelty that extended even to white criminals unlucky enough to fall into his custody. They will not let this stand, Thomas said quietly, confirming Sarah's fears. The one called Crawford, he has the smell of death about him. He enjoys causing pain. Then we need to leave, Sarah said, surprised by her own decisiveness. Right now, before they can organize against us. Alina shook her head firmly. Where will you go? You are strangers in this land, and Thomas is a marked man. Every town between here and Mexico will know his face within a week. My mining claim, Sarah said suddenly. It's several miles outside of town, up in the canyon country. We could go there, at least temporarily. Signora, that mine is nothing but empty holes in the rock. There is no shelter, no water reliable enough to sustain life. You would be trading one death for another. But Thomas had turned his head toward Sarah again, and she could sense his sudden attention even through the blindfold. Your claim is in the old Silver Canyon? Near the place where the red rocks form a natural fortress. I think so. The deed mentions red rock formations. Why? That land is sacred to my people. There are springs there that never run dry, caves that provide shelter even in the worst storms. If you truly own that ground. He paused, and Sarah could almost see him thinking through possibilities. It might be the one place in this territory where we could survive. Alina looked from Sarah to Thomas and back again, her expression torn between concern and something that might have been admiration. You are both loco, she said finally, but perhaps that is what it takes to survive in this world. She moved to a chest in the corner of the room and began pulling out supplies, dried meat, coffee, blankets, ammunition. If you are determined to do this foolish thing, you will not go unprepared. Outside, the crowd was growing more agitated. Sarah could hear footsteps on the wooden walkway, the jingle of spurs, the metallic click of weapons being checked and loaded. Whatever window of opportunity they might have had was closing rapidly. There is one more thing, Thomas said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The blindfold. If we are to travel together, if we are to survive what is coming, I need to see. Sarah looked at the strip of cloth covering his eyes. remembering Crawford's warning about Apache curses and hypnotic powers. Even Elena seemed nervous about the prospect, crossing herself again and muttering another prayer. "The white men fear our eyes because they fear the truth they might see reflected there," Thomas continued. "They know their actions cannot withstand honest scrutiny, so they prefer to blind those who might judge them." His words carried a weight of bitter experience that made Sarah's heart ache. She thought about her own experience of being dismissed and diminished, of having her thoughts and feelings discounted as feminine hysteria. How much worse must it be to have your very humanity denied, to be literally blinded so that others might feel more comfortable with their cruelty? The sound of heavy boots on the trading post's wooden steps made the decision for her. Sarah reached up and began working at the knot holding the blindfold in place, her fingers trembling slightly as she loosened the dirty cloth. "Signora, no," Alana whispered urgently. "What if the stories are true? What if the blindfold fell away and—" Thomas opened his eyes. Sarah found herself staring into the most beautiful and terrible gaze she had ever encountered. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, flecked with gold that seemed to catch and hold the light. But it wasn't their color that made her breath catch. It was the depth of intelligence and pain she saw there, the accumulated weight of suffering that no human being should have to carry. There was no curse in those eyes, no supernatural power that might bend her will to his. There was only Thomas Yazzie, war chief of the Navajo people, looking at her with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with something that might have been hope. "Thank you," he said simply. Before Sarah could respond, the trading post door burst open and Deputy Crawford strode in, flanked by two other men Sarah didn't recognize. The deputy's hand rested on the butt of his revolver, and his face was flushed with righteous anger. "That's enough of this nonsense," Crawford declared. "Mrs. Mitchell, you're coming with us. And as for you, Savage—" He stopped mid-sentence as his gaze fell on Thomas's uncovered face. The deputy actually took a step backward, his complexion paling noticeably. Thomas regarded Crawford with calm, steady eyes that seemed to look right through the man's bluster to something rotten underneath. He said nothing, but Sarah could feel the power radiating from him, supernatural power, but the natural authority of someone who had led others through life and death struggles, who had earned respect through courage and wisdom rather than demanding it through fear and violence. "You removed his blindfold," Crawford said, his voice pitched higher than normal. "Are you completely insane? Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've allowed a human being to see," Sarah replied, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. Something that should never have been taken from him in the first place. Crawford's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on an unhealthy purple. "That's it. Contract or no contract, I'm taking custody of this prisoner. He's clearly too dangerous to remain in civilian hands." "On what authority?" Thomas asked mildly. The question, spoken in perfect English with only the slightest trace of accent, seemed to throw Crawford completely off balance. He'd clearly expected either sullen silence or incomprehensible grunting, not articulate challenge to his legal standing. "On the authority of public safety," Crawford blustered, "and territorial law and basic common sense." "Territorial law recognizes the validity of lawfully executed contracts," Thomas continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the tension crackling through the room. "Mrs. Mitchell purchased my labor contract through proper legal channels with appropriate witnesses and documentation. Unless you're prepared to compensate her for the full purchase price plus damages, you have no legal standing to interfere with her property rights." Sarah stared at Thomas in amazement. Not only was he fluent in English, he apparently had a thorough understanding of territorial law. Crawford's face suggested he'd reached the same uncomfortable realization. "Property rights don't extend to dangerous weapons," Crawford said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "And that's what you are, Savage. a weapon pointed at the heart of every decent Christian family in this territory. Then perhaps, Thomas said, rising to his full height and fixing Crawford with that steady, unnerving gaze, those families should examine what they have done to earn such enmity. Part 3. The Observer's Introduction. The standoff in Rodriguez Trading Post stretched taut as a bowstring, with Deputy Crawford's hand hovering over his weapon and Thomas watching him. With the patience of a hunter who knows his prey is about to make a fatal mistake. Sarah found herself caught between terror and fascination, witnessing a battle of wills that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with moral authority. Just as Crawford's fingers began to curl around his gun handle, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Deputy, I believe there's been some confusion about jurisdiction here." Every head in the room turned toward the doorway, where a figure stood silhouetted against the harsh desert sunlight. As the man stepped inside, Sarah got her first clear look at someone who would change the trajectory of everything that followed. He was perhaps 40 years of age, tall and lean with the weathered complexion of someone who'd spent decades under the southwestern sun. His clothes were well made, but practical dark trousers, a white shirt open at the collar, and a black vest that showed no dust despite the desert setting. What struck Sarah most, however, were his eyes, pale blue, almost gray, and possessed of an intensity that seemed to catalog and evaluate everything they encountered. "Judge Morrison," Crawford stammered, his aggressive posture deflating like a punctured balloon. "I didn't realize you were in town." "Clearly," the newcomer replied dryly. His gaze swept the room, taking in Sarah's defensive stance, Elena's worried expression, Thomas's uncovered eyes, and Crawford's obvious discomfort with clinical precision. "I arrived this morning on business with Colonel Whitmore, just in time to witness what I can only describe as the most irregular prisoner auction in territorial history." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Of course her impulsive act had been witnessed by what appeared to be the one person in Copper Ridge whose opinion might actually matter. Judge Morrison. She'd heard the name whispered with a mixture of respect and fear throughout the frontier territories. He was said to be utterly incorruptible, completely immune to bribes or political pressure, and possessed of a legal mind that could find precedent and loopholes where others saw only blank walls. "Your Honor," Crawford began, "I was just explaining to Mrs. Mitchell that her purchase was irregular and potentially dangerous to..." "Deputy," Judge Morrison interrupted smoothly, "am I to understand that you're questioning the validity of a legal contract executed under proper authority with appropriate witnesses and documentation?" "Well, no, but..." "And are you suggesting that a widow's legal right to enter into binding agreements should be subject to your personal approval?" Crawford's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Sarah realized she was watching a master tactician dismantle an opponent through nothing more than careful questions and impeccable timing. "The prisoner is dangerous," Crawford finally managed. "He's killed soldiers, burned homesteads. He should be in chains, not walking free in a civilized town." Judge Morrison's pale eyes fixed on Thomas, who met his gaze without flinching or looking away. The two men studied each other for a long moment, and Sarah found herself holding her breath as she waited to see what verdict would emerge from this silent evaluation. "Thomas Yazzie," the judge said finally, "also known as Hastian Bijish, war chief of the Dine people, graduate of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, fluent in 4 languages, and according to military reports, one of the most effective guerrilla commanders in the Southwest." Thomas inclined his head slightly. "Your Honor knows more about me than most. I make it my business to know about the people who appear in my courtroom," Morrison replied. "Your capture was the result of betrayal, not military superiority. Someone sold information about your location to Colonel Whitmore in exchange for a considerable bounty." Sarah saw Thomas's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. This was clearly news to him, and not welcome news at that. She found herself wondering who among his own people might have been desperate or greedy enough to betray their war chief to the cavalry. "That may be," Thomas said carefully, "but it does not change my current circumstances." "No, Judge Morrison." "Agreed, but it does provide useful context for evaluating those circumstances." He turned to Sarah, and she felt the full weight of his analytical gaze. "Mrs. Mitchell, I presume you had reasons for your purchase beyond simple humanitarian impulse." The question caught Sarah off guard. She'd expected to be dismissed as a hysterical widow, or perhaps gently scolded for her impulsive behavior. She hadn't anticipated being asked to justify her actions as if they might actually make sense. She began, then stopped and gathered her thoughts. He was being sold like an animal. The way they talked about him, the things they planned to do, it was wrong. Whatever he may have done in the past, he's still a human being. "Admirable sentiment," Morrison said, "but hardly a practical foundation for a business relationship. What exactly do you plan to do with him?" Sarah glanced at Thomas, who was listening to this exchange with obvious interest despite his precarious position. "I own a mining claim in the canyon country. It needs work, and I need help. The arrangement seems mutually beneficial." It was a reasonable answer, Sarah thought, but she could see from Morrison's expression that he wasn't entirely convinced. There were too many gaps in her explanation, too many unstated motivations and unlikely coincidences. "Deputy Crawford," Morrison said suddenly, "you mentioned that Mr. Yazzie represents a danger to the community. Can you cite specific legal grounds for interfering with Mrs. Mitchell's contract?" Crawford's face flushed again. "He's a known killer. He's led raids against innocent settlers. Has he been convicted of any specific crimes in a court of law?" "Well, no, but has he been charged with any offenses under territorial jurisdiction?" The military captured him as an enemy combatant during what they classify as civil insurrection," Morrison interrupted. "That's a political matter, not a criminal one. Unless you can cite specific charges under territorial law, you have no authority to interfere with a valid contract." Sarah felt a surge of hope. If Judge Morrison was willing to support the legal validity of her purchase, perhaps there was a way out of this situation that didn't involve bloodshed or flight into the wilderness. But Crawford wasn't ready to concede defeat. "Your Honor, even if the contract is technically valid, surely public safety concerns override." "Public safety concerns," Morrison repeated thoughtfully. "Tell me, Deputy, how many incidents of violence or property damage have occurred since Mr. Yazzie's arrival in Copper Ridge?" "None, but how many threats has he made against local residents?" "None that I know of, but has he attempted to escape or resist his current circumstances in any way?" Crawford's silence stretched long enough to become damning. Thomas hadn't done anything to justify the deputy's fears except exist while being Apache, a crime that existed only in the prejudiced minds of men like Crawford. "Your Honor," Elena Rodriguez interjected quietly, "if I may speak?" Morrison nodded permission, and Elena stepped forward with the dignity of someone who'd earned respect through decades of honest dealing with people of all backgrounds. "This man," she said, gesturing toward Thomas, "he has been in my store for nearly an hour. My grandchildren play in the back room, just beyond that curtain. If he intended violence, if he was the savage animal these men claim, would I have allowed him to remain here? Would I have left my family unprotected in his presence?" It was a simple argument, but devastating in its logic. Elena Rodriguez was known throughout Copper Ridge as a woman of unshakable common sense, someone who'd raised 8 children and buried 2 husbands while building a successful business in one of the harshest environments on Earth. If she wasn't afraid of Thomas Yazzie, perhaps fear wasn't the appropriate response. Morrison absorbed this testimony with a slight nod, then returned his attention to Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, I find myself curious about your long-term plans." Assuming your legal right to Mr. Yazzi's labor contract is upheld, what specific work do you intend for him to perform? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words might determine not just her own fate, but Thomas's as well. My husband left me a silver mine claim in the canyon country east of town. Previous attempts to work the claim have failed, but I believe that was due to inadequate understanding of the local geology and water sources. Mr. Yazzie has knowledge of that country that could prove invaluable. It was partly true, though. Sarah was improvising wildly based on Thomas's earlier comments about springs and caves. She could only hope he would play along with her fabrication. Interesting, Morrison said. And Mr. Yazzie, what is your assessment of this proposed arrangement? Thomas was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could almost see him weighing his options. He could expose her improvisation, reveal that they'd barely spoken before this moment, and perhaps improve his chances of being transferred to military custody, where his fate might be marginally more predictable. Or he could trust the woman who'd spent her last money to remove him from Crawford's reach. The land Mrs. Mitchell describes is known to my people, he said finally. There are indeed resources there that previous miners overlooked. With proper knowledge and careful work, it might prove profitable. Sarah felt a wave of relief so intense it made her slightly dizzy. Thomas had chosen to support her story, to link his fate with hers, despite having every reason to distrust white promises and white justice. Morrison studied them both for another long moment, his pale eyes moving from Sarah's nervous determination to Thomas's controlled composure and back again. Whatever he saw in their faces seemed to satisfy some internal calculation. Deputy Crawford, he said finally, I find no legal justification for interfering with Mrs. Mitchell's contract. Mr. Yazzie will remain under her supervision, subject to the terms and conditions already established. Crawford's face went through several more color changes before settling on a mottled combination of red and white. Your Honor, I must protest. This sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow Deputy, Morrison's voice carried a note of finality that cut through Crawford's objections like a scythe through wheat. The law is the law. You may disagree with it. You may petition the territorial legislature to change it. But you may not ignore it to suit your personal preferences. Is that understood? Crawford's hand had drifted back toward his weapon during this exchange, and for one terrible moment, Sarah thought he might actually draw on a territorial judge. But whatever madness might have been building in the deputy's mind, it wasn't quite strong enough to overcome his survival instinct. Understood, Your Honor, he said finally, the words scraped out through gritted teeth. Excellent. Now I suggest you return to your regular duties and allow these people to conduct their lawful business in peace. Crawford turned and stalked toward the door, followed by his two companions who looked relieved to be leaving without violence. But just before he reached the threshold, the deputy turned back to fix Sarah with a stare full of malevolent promise. This isn't over, he said quietly. Mark my words, widow. That savage will show his true nature sooner or later, and when he does, I'll be there to clean up the mess. The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the adobe walls, leaving the trading post feeling suddenly cavernous in its silence. Sarah realized she'd been holding her breath and let it out in a shaky sigh. That man will be trouble, Thomas observed calmly. Deputy Crawford has always been trouble, Elena replied. But now he has been publicly humiliated, which will make him twice as dangerous. Judge Morrison moved to the window and watched Crawford's retreating figure with the attention of someone cataloging a potential threat. Mrs. Mitchell, he said without turning around, might I suggest that you and Mr. Yazzie depart for your mining claim as soon as practical? Deputy Crawford's authority within town limits is considerable, but it diminishes significantly in the outlying territories. You think he'll try something? Sarah asked. Morrison turned from the window, and Sarah was struck again by the intelligence in those pale eyes. I think Deputy Crawford is a man who defines himself through the exercise of power over others. You've just demonstrated that his power has limits, which is something he cannot allow to stand unchallenged. Thomas nodded grimly. He will come. If not today, then tomorrow. If not officially, then with men who share his beliefs about what should happen to Apache warriors. The casual certainty in his voice sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She was beginning to understand that her impulsive act of mercy had set in motion forces that would not be easily controlled or contained. Then we should leave immediately, she said. See, Elena agreed, adding items to the supplies she'd already gathered. Take food, water, ammunition. The desert does not forgive poor preparation, and neither will men like Crawford. Judge Morrison. Watch these preparations with obvious approval. A wise decision. And Mrs. Mitchell? If your mining venture proves successful, I'd be interested in seeing your assay reports. The territorial government is always eager to encourage legitimate mineral extraction. There was something in his tone that suggested Judge Morrison suspected. There might be more to Sarah's story than simple mining ambitions, but he seemed content to allow the fiction to stand as long as it served the cause of justice. Within minutes, Elena had assembled enough supplies to sustain 2 people for several days in the desert. Sarah gathered her few personal belongings, acutely aware that she was about to leave behind the last vestige of civilization she might see for a very long time. As they prepared to depart, Thomas approached Judge Morrison with the careful respect of someone who understood exactly how much he owed to the elder man's intervention. Your Honor, he said quietly, I will not forget what you have done here today. Morrison studied him for a moment. Mr. Yazzie, I did nothing more than uphold the law as written. But I will say this, you have been given an unusual opportunity for a fresh start. I hope you'll make the most of it. I intend to, Your Honor. Sarah found herself oddly moved by this exchange between 2 men who, under different circumstances, might have faced each other as enemies. There was a mutual recognition of integrity that transcended the racial and cultural barriers that divided their worlds. Mrs. Mitchell, Morrison said, turning to her as they prepared to leave, you've undertaken something extraordinary today. Whether it proves wise or foolish remains to be seen, but it was undoubtedly courageous. Thank you, Your Honor, though I'm not sure courage had much to do with it. Morrison smiled for the first time since entering the trading post. In my experience, courage rarely feels like courage to the person exercising it. It usually feels like doing what needs to be done, regardless of the personal cost. As they stepped out into the blazing afternoon sun, Sarah reflected on the judge's words. She hadn't felt particularly courageous when she'd bid on Thomas's contract. She'd felt desperate, angry, and perhaps a little reckless. But perhaps those emotions, when channeled toward justice rather than self-interest, could serve the same purpose as traditional courage. The streets of Copper Ridge seemed different now, charged with an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there that morning. People watched from windows and doorways as Sarah and Thomas made their way toward the livery stable, their faces showing everything from curiosity to outright hostility. Word of the confrontation at the trading post had clearly spread, and Sarah could feel the weight of collective judgment pressing down on her like the desert heat. But there was something else in the air as well, something harder to define, a sense of change perhaps, or possibility. Sarah had done something unprecedented in Copper Ridge, something that challenged the established order in ways both large and small. The consequences of that challenge were yet to be determined, but the change itself was irreversible. As they walked through the dusty streets toward an uncertain future, Sarah found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. Thomas moved with fluid grace despite having spent hours in bonds, his dark eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for potential threats. He was, she realized, exactly what Crawford had claimed, a dangerous man, a trained warrior, someone capable of violence when circumstances demanded it. But he was also something Crawford could never understand, a man of honor, someone who had chosen to link his fate with hers, despite having every reason to distrust white promises and white justice. That choice, freely made in the face of enormous personal risk, meant more to Sarah than all of Judge Morrison's legal arguments combined. Whatever lay ahead in the canyon country, whatever challenges and dangers awaited them in the days to come, they would face them together. And for the first time since Robert's death, Sarah Mitchell felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest like a flame, that had been banked but never quite extinguished. Part 4. Temporary Relief and Persistent Struggles. The livery stable sat at the eastern edge of Copper Ridge, a weathered structure that smelled of hay, leather, and the particular mixture of dust and manure that seemed to permeate every frontier settlement. Sarah pushed open the heavy wooden door, grateful for the relative coolness inside after the punishing heat of the afternoon sun. Thomas followed silently, his eyes already adapting to the dimmer light, and cataloging the stable's layout with the automatic wariness of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on knowing all the exits. Behind the front counter, a grizzled man in his 60s looked up from a harness he was mending. Pete Kowalski had run the livery stable for 15 years, and in that time he'd developed a reputation for fair dealing and stubborn independence that had earned him grudging respect even from people who disapproved of his willingness to do business with anyone who could pay his prices. "Mrs. Mitchell," Pete said, setting down his leather working tools. "Heard you had some excitement in town today." His eyes flicked to Thomas, taking in the man's height, the scars, and the alert posture of someone accustomed to danger. But unlike most of the other townspeople, Pete showed no obvious fear or hostility. "I need to rent a wagon and team," Sarah said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Something sturdy enough for canyon country." Pete scratched his bristly chin thoughtfully. "That's rough territory out there. Most folks who try to work those old silver claims end up coming back empty-handed and half-dead from thirst." He paused, studying Sarah's determined expression. "Course, most folks don't have local expertise to guide them." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for Pete's diplomatic phrasing. He was clearly aware of Thomas's identity and background, but he was choosing to treat him as a resource rather than a threat. "We'll need supplies for several days," Sarah continued. "Water barrels, tools, food stores, and—" She hesitated, then forced herself to continue. "Weapons, in case we encounter difficulties." Pete's expression grew more serious. "What kind of difficulties you expecting, Mrs. Mitchell?" Before Sarah could answer, Thomas stepped forward slightly. "The kind that wear badges and travel in groups after dark," he said quietly. The two men looked at each other for a long moment, and Sarah sensed some form of communication passing between them that she didn't fully understand. Pete had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in hard country, dealing with hard men. He would understand the implications of Thomas's words better than most. "Well then," Pete said finally, "I reckon you'll be wanting my best team and the reinforced wagon. And maybe some extra ammunition." He moved toward the back of the stable, gesturing for them to follow. "Got just the outfit for you. Built it myself for hauling silver ore back when the mines were producing. Strong enough to carry a full load over the roughest ground you're likely to encounter." The wagon Pete showed them was indeed impressive heavy built, with iron-reinforced wheels and a canvas cover that could be secured against weather or prying eyes. The team consisted of 4 sturdy mules that looked capable of pulling their load through whatever terrain the canyon country might offer. "This will do perfectly," Sarah said, though her heart sank as she thought about what this equipment would cost. She'd already spent most of her money on Thomas's contract and a wagon. Rental of this quality would claim most of what remained. Pete seemed to read her thoughts. "Tell you what," he said, "you pay me half now, half when you bring the wagon back. Fair enough?" It was more than fair. It was an act of kindness that Sarah suspected Pete wouldn't have extended to most customers. "Thank you," she said, meaning it deeply. "That's very generous." "Ain't generosity," Pete replied gruffly. "Just good business. You strike silver out there, you'll remember who helped you get started." But Sarah caught the slight smile that accompanied his words, and she understood that Pete Kowalski was another of those rare frontier souls who chose kindness over fear when presented with the unknown. As Pete began loading their supplies, other customers began arriving at the stable. Sarah recognized most of them: Henry Walsh from the general store, Martha Stevens from the boarding house, and several other merchants and townspeople who'd been part of the crowd at the auction. Their conversations died as they noticed Sarah and Thomas, replaced by the kind of pointed silence that felt more hostile than any direct confrontation. "Heard you had some trouble with Deputy Crawford," Henry Walsh said loudly, ostensibly addressing Pete but clearly intending his words for Sarah's ears. Shame when outsiders don't understand how things work in an established community. Things work just fine when people mind their own business and follow the law, Pete replied without looking up from the harness he was loading. Some folks would do well to remember that. Martha Stevens drew herself up to her full height, which wasn't considerable but seemed imposing through sheer force of indignation. "Mr. Kowalski, surely you can't approve of what this woman has done. Bringing that savage into our community, removing his restraints, treating him like some kind of honored guest. It's an insult to every decent Christian family in Copper Ridge." Thomas had been standing quietly beside the wagon, but Martha's words caused him to turn and fix her with that steady, unnerving gaze that had so unsettled Deputy Crawford. When he spoke, his voice was calm and conversational, which somehow made his words more cutting than any angry retort could have been. "Mrs. Stevens, I believe your boarding house advertises Christian hospitality and charitable rates for travelers in need. How exactly does that square with your current attitude towards someone you've never spoken to and know nothing about?" Martha's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound. She'd clearly expected either sullen silence or incomprehensible grunting from Thomas, not articulate challenge delivered in better English than most of the town's residents could manage. Henry Walsh stepped forward, his face flushed with the kind of righteous anger that often accompanies the discovery that one's prejudices are more complicated than previously believed. "Listen here, savage. I don't care how well you can parrot white man's words. We know what you are, what you've done. Don't think putting on civilized airs will fool anyone." "And what exactly do you know about what I've done?" Thomas asked. Mildly, "Have you read military reports? Spoken to witnesses? Or are you basing your knowledge on campfire stories and newspaper accounts written by men who've never set foot in Apache country?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a badly tended fire. Sarah found herself watching the faces around her, seeing the uncomfortable realization that their certainty about Thomas's crimes was based more on assumption than evidence. It was a masterful piece of psychological warfare. Thomas wasn't denying anything, but he was forcing his accusers to examine the foundation of their beliefs. Pete continued loading supplies with methodical efficiency, but Sarah could see the hint of a smile playing around the corners of his mouth. He was clearly enjoying watching Thomas dismantle the moral superiority of Copper Ridge's self-appointed guardians of civilization. "We know you're a killer," Henry said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "The army doesn't capture war chiefs for stealing chickens." "No," Thomas agreed. "They capture war chiefs for defending their people against invasion and genocide. The army calls it resistance. I call it doing what any man would do when his family is threatened." The simple honesty of this statement seemed to hit the crowd like a physical blow. Whatever crimes Thomas might have committed, whatever blood might be on his hands, he wasn't trying to hide behind legal technicalities or claim innocence. He was standing by his actions while challenging others to examine the context that had made those actions necessary. Sarah felt a surge of admiration for Thomas's moral courage, but she also recognized the danger in his directness. These people had come to the stable expecting to find a dangerous savage they could fear and despise with clear consciences. Instead, they were confronting a man who spoke with the quiet authority of someone who'd been forced to make impossible choices, was prepared to defend those choices on their merits. "That's enough," Martha Stevens said shrilly. "I don't have to stand here and listen to savage philosophy. Pete Kowalski, if you rent equipment to these people, you'll be contributing to whatever violence follows. Their blood will be on your hands." Pete straightened to his full height, which was considerable, and fixed Martha with a stare that could have frozen water in July. "Mrs. Stevens, I've been doing business in this territory since before there was a Copper Ridge. I've dealt with miners, ranchers, soldiers, Apache, Navajo, Mexican traders, and every other kind of human being you can imagine. In all that time, I've learned to judge people by what they do, not what they look like or where they come from." He gestured toward Thomas with a work-hardened hand. "This man has been in my stable for 20 minutes. In that time, he's been polite, respectful, and honest about potential dangers we might face. He's helped load supplies without being asked. He's kept his voice level despite considerable provocation, and he's shown more Christian charity than most of the so-called Christians in this town." Martha's face went through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple that clashed badly with her bonnet. "How dare you? How dare I what?" Pete interrupted. "How dare I treat all customers with equal respect? How dare I judge people by their actions rather than their race? How dare I run my business according to my own conscience instead of letting a bunch of gossipy busybodies dictate my decisions?" The confrontation was drawing attention from other parts of the stable. Several more townspeople had drifted over, creating a growing crowd of onlookers who seemed evenly divided between those who supported Pete's position and those who sided with Martha's outrage. Sarah realized that she and Thomas had become the focal point of a larger conflict that had probably been brewing in Copper Ridge for years. Pete represented the pragmatic frontier spirit that judged people by their usefulness and reliability. Martha and her supporters represented the more conventional social order that required clear divisions between acceptable and unacceptable people. "The fact remains," Henry Walsh said, trying to regain control of the argument, "that harboring a known Apache warrior puts the entire community at risk. What happens when his people come looking for him? What happens when they find him living free and comfortable in a white settlement?" It was a shrewd question, Sarah realized. Henry was appealing to practical fears rather than moral prejudices, which might prove more effective with people like Pete, who prided themselves on hard-headed realism. Thomas considered the question seriously before answering. "My people believe I am dead," he said finally. "The betrayal that led to my capture was designed to look like death in battle. As far as the Navajo Nation is concerned, Hastian Bejish died fighting the cavalry near Fort Verde." This revelation sent a murmur through the growing crowd. Sarah felt her own understanding of Thomas's situation shift dramatically. He wasn't just a captured warrior, he was a man who'd been erased from his own life, cut off from his people as completely as if he'd actually died in that battle. Then, "You have no one," Martha said, and for the first time there was something like pity in her voice. "No family, no tribe, no people to claim you." "I have what everyone has," Thomas replied quietly. "The opportunity to build something new from what remains." Sarah found herself blinking back unexpected tears. There was something deeply moving about Thomas's quiet acceptance of his isolation, his refusal to be defined by what he'd lost rather than what he might still create. It reminded her of her own situation, widowed, nearly penniless, far from anyone who might remember her fondly or mourn her passing. Perhaps that was why she'd bid on his contract, she realized. Not out of simple mercy or humanitarian impulse, But because she'd recognized a fellow survivor, someone else who'd been stripped of everything familiar and forced to start over with nothing but determination and hope. "Mrs. Mitchell," Pete said gently, breaking into her thoughts, "your wagons. Loaded and ready. You'll want to get moving soon if you plan to reach your claim before dark." Sarah nodded, grateful for Pete's tactful suggestion. The crowd around them was growing larger and more restless, and she could sense the potential for real trouble if they remained much longer. As she climbed onto the wagon seat, Thomas swung up beside her with fluid grace. The mules stamped and snorted, eager to be moving after standing patient during the long confrontation. "One more thing," Henry Walsh called out as Sarah gathered the reins. "When that savage shows his true nature, when he robs you or kills you or runs off to rejoin his war party, don't expect any sympathy from this town. You made your choice against all advice and common sense." Sarah looked down at Henry's flushed face and felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "Mr. Walsh," she said clearly, "I'd rather take my chances with one honest man than trust my safety to a dozen cowards who hide their fear behind righteous speeches." The words rang across the stable yard like a slap, and Sarah saw several faces, flush with anger or shame. She'd just called the moral leadership of Copper Ridge cowards to their faces, which was either the bravest or most foolish thing she'd ever done. Thomas made a soft sound that might have been suppressed laughter. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I believe you've just made some enemies." "I believe I had them already," Sarah replied, snapping the reins. The mules lurched forward, pulling the heavily loaded wagon toward the eastern trail that led into the canyon country. As they rolled out of Copper Ridge, Sarah caught sight of Deputy Crawford standing in the shadow of the sheriff's office, watching their departure with the focused attention of a predator studying prey. Even at a distance, she could feel the malevolent intensity of his gaze, and she understood that Judge Morrison's legal protection would mean nothing once they left the town limits. "He'll follow us," Thomas observed, confirming her fears. "How?" "Soon, not immediately. He'll want to gather men first, maybe wait for official cover, but he'll come." Thomas studied the rough trail ahead, his eyes noting landmarks and potential ambush sites with professional thoroughness. "We have perhaps a day, maybe two if we're fortunate." The wagon wheels crunched over loose gravel as they climbed into the foothills east of town. The desert landscape spread around them in waves of red rock and sparse vegetation, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Sarah had never been this far from civilization before, and the vastness of the country was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Tell me about this land," she said as they bounced over a particularly rough section of trail. "You mentioned springs and caves. Is there really enough water to sustain life out here?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, and Sarah sensed he was weighing how much truth to share with her. Finally, he pointed toward a cluster of red rock formations rising from the desert floor like ancient towers. "My grandmother brought me to this place when I was 12 years old," he said. "She wanted me to understand that the earth provides for those who know how to read her signs. There are 3 springs within those rocks, fed by underground streams that never fail even in the driest years. There are caves that stay cool in summer and warm in winter, places where a small band could survive indefinitely if they understood the land's gifts." Sarah stared at the distant formations, trying to imagine them as anything other than empty wilderness. "Your grandmother was Navajo?" "Apache," Thomas corrected. "My father was Navajo, my mother Apache. The marriage was unusual. Both tribes accepted me, but neither fully claimed me. Perhaps that's why I was easier to betray." There was no self-pity in his voice, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd learned to live with complicated truths. Sarah found herself wanting to know more about his background, about the family and culture he'd lost, but she sensed that such questions would have to wait until trust had been more fully established between them. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as they climbed higher into the canyon country. Sarah's dress was soaked with perspiration, and she could feel the desert heat sapping her strength with every mile. But Thomas seemed unaffected by the temperature, his dark eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead for signs of danger or opportunity. As they reached a small plateau that offered a view back toward Copper Ridge, Thomas suddenly held up his hand. "Stop," he said quietly. Sarah pulled back on the reins, bringing the mules to a halt. "What is it?" Thomas was staring back down the trail they'd just climbed, his body tense with the alertness of a hunting animal. Sarah followed his gaze but saw nothing except empty desert and shimmering heat. "Dust," Thomas said finally. "Someone's following. U.S. staying just far enough back to avoid being seen." Sarah squinted at the distant trail, and after a moment she caught sight of what Thomas had noticed, a faint haze of dust rising from the valley floor, too regular and persistent to be caused by wind. "Crawford?" she asked. "Or someone working?" "For him, they're not trying very hard to hide their presence, which means they want us to know we're being followed." Sarah felt her stomach clench with fear. "What do they hope to accomplish?" "Fear," Thomas said simply. "They want us to panic, to make mistakes, to exhaust ourselves running before they close the trap." He studied the approaching dust cloud with professional interest. "It's a sound strategy against inexperienced prey." The casual way he used the word prey sent a chill down Sarah's spine despite the desert heat. She was beginning to understand that whatever else Thomas Yazzie might be, he was a man who'd spent years in a world where survival depended on thinking like both hunter and hunted. "What do we do?" she asked. Thomas looked ahead toward the red rock formations, calculating distances and possibilities with the swift precision of a battlefield commander. "We continue as planned, but we prepare for the possibility that we may have to fight for what we're trying to build." As they resumed their journey toward the uncertain sanctuary of the canyon country, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had changed in the space of a single day. That morning she'd been a desperate widow with nowhere to turn and no one to depend on. Now she was fleeing into the wilderness with a man she barely knew, pursued by enemies who wanted to destroy them both. It should have been terrifying, and part of her was certainly afraid. But there was something else growing alongside the fear, a sense of purpose and possibility that she hadn't felt since Robert's death. For the first time in months, she was moving toward something rather than just running away from failure and disappointment. Whatever lay ahead in the Red Rock country, whatever challenges and dangers awaited them in the days to come, Sarah Mitchell was no longer facing them alone. And somehow that made all the difference in the world. Part 5. Escalating Persecution and Backstory Reveal. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Sarah and Thomas reached the mouth of Silver Canyon, where red sandstone walls rose like ancient sentinels on either side of a narrow passage that seemed to lead straight into the heart of the earth itself. The trail here was barely wide enough for their wagon, forcing them to proceed slowly while loose rocks scattered beneath the mules' hooves with sounds like breaking glass. Thomas had grown increasingly watchful as they climbed higher into the Fonda Canyon country, his dark eyes constantly moving between the trail ahead and the rocky heights above where an ambush might easily be concealed. The dust cloud that had been following them had disappeared an hour ago, but Sarah could see from his tense posture that he didn't interpret this development as good news. "They've stopped following the main trail," he said as they navigated around a boulder that had fallen from the canyon wall sometime in the recent past, which means they either know another route to where we're going, or they've decided to wait for us to come back. Sarah wiped perspiration from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of red dust across her skin. "Is there another route?" "Several. This canyon system connects to others, forming a network that extends for miles in every direction. A man who knew the country could approach our destination from half a dozen different angles." The implications of this information settled over Sarah like a cold shadow despite the desert heat. If Crawford and his men knew the local geography well enough to outflank them, then their flight into the wilderness might prove to be exactly the trap their pursuers had hoped for. "You think they planned this?" she said. "It wasn't really a question." Thomas nodded grimly. "Deputy Crawford has been hunting Apache and Navajo for years. He knows this country almost as well as we do. Better, perhaps, since he's had access to military maps and survey reports that our people never saw." As if summoned by the mention of his name, the distant sound of voices echoed off the canyon walls from somewhere behind them. Sarah couldn't make out words, but the tone carried clearly men calling to each other with the casual confidence of hunters who'd cornered their prey. "How many?" Sarah asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Thomas tilted his head, listening to the acoustic patterns bouncing between the canyon walls with the trained ear of someone who'd spent years interpreting such sounds. "4, maybe 5. Enough to be dangerous, not so many that they can't move." Quickly, the wagon lurched over another rough section of trail, and Sarah heard something shift in the load behind them. Pete Kowalski had been generous with supplies, including items that Sarah was only now beginning to appreciate fully: ammunition, tools that could serve as weapons, and several coils of rope that might prove useful in rocky terrain. "There," Thomas said suddenly, pointing toward a narrow opening in the canyon wall that Sarah might have missed entirely if he hadn't directed her attention to it. "Turn there." Sarah pulled on the reins, guiding the reluctant mules toward what appeared to be little more than a crack in the red sandstone. But as they drew closer, she could see that the opening was wider than it first appeared, and a faint path led through it toward some hidden destination. "This is the way my grandmother brought me," Thomas explained as they squeezed through the narrow passage. "She said the spirits of the land hid their greatest gifts behind walls that looked impassable to those who didn't know how to see." The passage opened into a circular valley, perhaps a quarter-mile across, completely hidden from the outside world and surrounded by sheer rock walls that rose hundreds of feet into the darkening sky. At the center of the valley stood a cluster of ruins, adobe buildings, and stone foundations that spoke of ancient habitation. But what took Sarah's breath away was the water. A spring emerged from the base of the eastern wall, feeding a clear stream that meandered across the valley floor, before disappearing into an underground channel on the opposite side. Around the stream, vegetation grew in impossible profusion: cottonwoods, willows, and grasses that created an oasis of green in the heart of the red desert. "My God," Sarah whispered, staring at this unexpected paradise. "It's beautiful." Thomas swung down from the wagon seat and walked to the stream, kneeling to cup the clear water in his hands and taste it. "Sweet," he said with satisfaction. "The underground channels filter it through miles of rock before it reaches the surface." Sarah climbed down from the wagon on unsteady legs, her body aching from hours of rough travel. But the sight of flowing water and green grass made her feel renewed in ways that had nothing to do with physical comfort. This place felt sacred, untouched by the greed and violence that seemed to contaminate so much of the frontier world. "Who built these?" she asked, walking among the ruins and running her fingers over walls that had been constructed with obvious skill and care. "The old ones," Thomas replied. "The people who lived here before the Apache, before the Navajo, before anyone whose names are still remembered. My grandmother said they were here when the world was young, when men and spirits walked together, and the earth freely shared her secrets." The reverence in his voice made Sarah look at the ruins with new eyes. These weren't just ancient buildings. They were monuments to a way of life that had flourished in this hidden valley centuries before the arrival of European civilization. "She brought you here to teach you something," Sarah said, understanding intuitively that Thomas's childhood visit had been more than casual exploration. Thomas nodded, his expression distant as he remembered. "She wanted me to understand that the land remembers everything, every people who have lived on it, Every drop of blood that has been spilled, every act of kindness or cruelty. She said that if I learned to listen, the land would teach me how to survive anything. The voices from the canyon mouth were growing closer, though still muffled by distance and intervening rock walls. Sarah realized that their pursuers would eventually find the hidden passagemen like Crawford were nothing if not persistent, and they had time to search every possible route. "We can't stay here," she said, though part of her wanted nothing more than to make camp beside the stream and pretend the outside world didn't exist. "No," Thomas agreed, "but we can prepare." He began unloading supplies from the wagon with swift efficiency, his movements guided by some plan that was forming in his mind. "Help me carry these to the ruins. If we're going to make a stand, we might as well do it in a place that has seen others fight for their freedom." As they worked to establish a defensive position among the ancient walls, Thomas began to speak in a low voice that seemed perfectly suited to the gathering dusk. "You asked about my past," he said, shouldering a bag of grain that would feed the mules for several days. "About what I did to earn the hatred of men like Crawford." Sarah looked up from the ammunition she was sorting, sensing that Thomas was about to share something that he'd kept locked away since his capture. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "If we're going to face what's coming together, you need to understand what kind of man you've tied your fate to." They worked in companionable silence for several minutes while Thomas seemed to gather his thoughts. When he finally began to speak, his voice carried the weight of memories that had been both treasured and endured. "I was 15 when the cavalry first came to our lands in force," he said. "Not the small patrols and trading expeditions we'd seen before, but entire regiments with orders to clear the territory for white settlement. They called it pacification, but we knew it for what it was, the systematic destruction of everything our people had built over generations." Sarah listened while continuing to organize their supplies, understanding that Thomas needed to tell this story in his own way and his own time. "My father tried negotiation first. He was a man who believed that reason could triumph over greed if the arguments were presented clearly enough. He spent months traveling between army posts and territorial offices, trying to arrange a treaty that would allow our people to remain on at least part of our ancestral lands." Thomas paused in his work, staring at the ancient ruins as if seeing them populated with the ghosts of their long-dead builders. "The negotiations were a sham. While my father talked peace with officials in Santa Fe, cavalry units were already moving to surround our villages. The white authorities never intended to honor any agreement. They were simply buying time to position their forces for maximum effectiveness." Sarah felt her heart clench with sympathetic anger. She'd heard similar stories from other displaced peoples throughout the territories, but hearing it from Thomas, seeing the pain in his dark eyes as he remembered his father's betrayed trust, made the injustice feel immediate and personal. "What happened to your father?" she asked softly. "He died still believing in the possibility of honorable compromise," Thomas replied. "A cavalry patrol found him traveling alone on his way to what he thought was a final negotiating session. They said he was resisting arrest. The 3 bullets in his back suggested otherwise." The matter-of-fact way Thomas recounted his father's murder was somehow more heartbreaking than any emotional outburst could have been. Sarah recognized the tone of someone who'd learned to carry grief without letting it paralyze him, who'd transformed personal loss into fuel for survival. "That's when you became a war chief," she said. "That's when I stopped believing that white men were capable of honor," Thomas corrected. "The war chief title came later, after I'd proven that Apache and Navajo could work together when their survival depended on it." He resumed unloading supplies, but Sarah could see that the memories were still flowing, still demanding expression after months of enforced silence. "We fought a different kind of war than the one the cavalry expected," Thomas continued. "Small groups, quick strikes, always moving, never giving them a target they could destroy with superior numbers and firepower. We weren't trying to defeat the United States Army. That would have been impossible. We were trying to make the conquest of our land so expensive in blood and treasure that the government would reconsider the wisdom of their policy. Sarah began to understand the scope of what Thomas had accomplished, and why men like Crawford regarded him as such a dangerous threat. He hadn't just been a warrior, he'd been a military innovator who'd found ways to neutralize his enemy's advantages while maximizing his own people's strengths. For 3 years it worked, Thomas said with grim satisfaction. Settlements were abandoned, mining operations shut down, entire cavalry regiments reassigned to other territories because the cost of maintaining them here was becoming politically unsustainable. What changed? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Thomas's expression darkened. Betrayal. Someone close to our leadership began selling information to the army troop movements, supply caches, the locations of villages where women and children were sheltering. The cavalry started appearing, exactly where and when they could do the most damage. The pain in his voice was sharper now, the wound of treachery clearly still raw despite the months that had passed since his capture. We tried to identify the traitor, but they were clever. Information was passed through intermediaries, payments made in ways that couldn't be traced back to any individual. For weeks we fought an enemy who seemed to anticipate our every move. Thomas set down the supplies he'd been carrying and walked to the stream, staring into the clear water as if it might reveal answers to questions that still tormented him. The end came at dawn on a day when we thought we were safe, he said. We'd spent the night in a hidden canyon, planning what we hoped would be a decisive strike against a cavalry supply train. But when the sun rose, we found ourselves surrounded by 3 companies of soldiers who'd moved into position during the darkness. Sarah joined him beside the stream, drawn by the gravity of his recounting and the obvious cost it was exacting from him to relive these memories. Most of my warriors died in the first minutes of the fight, Thomas continued. They died believing they were protecting their families, never knowing that someone they trusted had sold them to their enemies for silver coins. But you survived, Sarah said. I survived because I was knocked unconscious by a rifle butt before I could die with honor alongside my men. When I woke up, I was in chains, being displayed like a trophy for newspaper reporters and territorial officials who wanted to prove that the Apache threat had been permanently eliminated. The bitterness in Thomas's voice was like acid eating at pretenses and comfortable lies. Sarah began to understand why his capture had been such a significant victory for the territorial authorities. He represented not just a dangerous enemy, but the embodiment of successful resistance to their expansion plans. They paraded me through every major settlement between Fort Verde and Denver, Thomas said. A tamed savage, proof that white civilization would inevitably triumph over barbarism. Colonel Whitmore gave speeches about the civilizing influence of Christian mercy, about how my capture demonstrated that even the most savage warriors could be broken and reformed. Sarah felt sick thinking about the humiliation Thomas had endured. The systematic attempt to destroy not just his body, but his spirit and dignity. That's why they kept you blindfolded. Among other reasons. They claimed it was for public safety, but the real purpose was to complete my dehumanization. A man who cannot see, cannot make eye contact, cannot return the gaze of those who stare at him, such a man becomes an object rather than a person. The voices from outside the valley were much closer now, echoing off the canyon walls with increasing clarity. Sarah could make out individual words, the harsh laughter of men who thought they were closing in on helpless prey. They're coming, she said. Thomas nodded, but he didn't seem frightened by the approaching confrontation. If anything, he appeared almost relieved, as if the prospect of open conflict was preferable to the helpless endurance he'd been forced to accept during his months of captivity. Sarah, he said, using her given name for the first time, you Need to understand something before this goes any further. If those men take me alive, they won't just kill me. They'll make an example of me, something designed to terrorize any other Indians who might be tempted to resist white authority. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Then we'll make sure they don't take you alive. The simple determination in her voice seemed to surprise Thomas. He studied her face in the gathering darkness, perhaps seeing something there that he hadn't expected from a woman who'd lived most of her life in the civilized East. "You've changed," he observed, "from the woman who bought my contract this morning." Sarah considered this, thinking about how different she felt from the desperate widow who'd stepped off the stagecoach just 12 hours earlier. Perhaps I'm just becoming who I was meant to be. The sound of horses entering the hidden valley made further conversation impossible. Crawford and his men had found them, just as Thomas had predicted they would. But Sarah discovered that she wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry at men who used badges and righteous speeches to justify cruelty, angry at a system that treated human beings as property to be bought and sold, angry at her own past passivity in the face of injustice. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she would meet it standing beside a man who'd fought his entire adult life for the right to exist with dignity and freedom. And for the first time since Robert's death, Sarah Mitchell felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The sound of hoofbeats echoed through the hidden valley like thunder, multiplied and distorted by the surrounding canyon walls, until it seemed as though an entire cavalry regiment was descending upon them. Sarah crouched behind the crumbling wall of an ancient dwelling, her hand steady on the rifle Pete Kowalski had included among their supplies, though her heart hammered against her ribs with a rhythm that threatened to drown out her ability to think clearly. Beside her, Thomas moved with the fluid silence of a predator, checking their defensive positions and ammunition supplies with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd fought this kind of battle many times before. His transformation from captured prisoner to war chief was complete. Gone was any trace of the bound and blindfolded man who'd stood on that auction platform, replaced by someone who radiated lethal competence and absolute calm in the face of mortal danger. "5 riders," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of approaching horses. "Crawford, 2 deputies, and 2 civilians. Probably men he recruited from the saloon with promises of reward money or Apache scalps." Sarah peered through a gap in the ancient stonework, catching her first glimpse of their pursuers as they emerged from the narrow passage into the hidden valley. Deputy Crawford sat his horse with the swagger of a man who believed he held all the advantages, his hand resting casually on his sidearm while his pale eyes surveyed the ruins with predatory satisfaction. "Well, well," Crawford called out, his voice carrying easily across the small valley. "Look what we found hiding in the rocks like rats in a granary. Mrs. Mitchell, I hope you've enjoyed your little adventure, because it's about to come to an end." The other riders spread out in a rough semicircle, cutting off any obvious escape routes while maintaining enough distance to avoid presenting easy targets. Sarah recognized one of them as Frank Morrison, no relation to the judge, a failed prospector who'd turned to bounty hunting when his mining claims proved worthless. The others were strangers, but their weathered faces and casual handling of weapons marked them as men accustomed to violence. "You're outside your jurisdiction, Crawford," Thomas called back, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command despite their desperate circumstances. "This land falls under federal territory, not county law." Crawford's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Jurisdiction's a funny thing out here, Savage. Tends to extend as far as a man's willing to ride and as deep as his bullets can reach." One of the civilian riders, a heavy-set man with tobacco-stained whiskers, spat into the dust and shifted restlessly in his saddle. "Can we get on with this, deputy? Sun's getting low, and I don't fancy spending the night in Apache country." "Patience, Henderson," Crawford replied. "I want to give our fugitives a chance to surrender peacefully. Mrs. Mitchell, you can still walk away from this." Turn over the savage and ride back to town with us. No charges filed, no questions asked about your temporary lapse of judgment." Sarah felt Thomas tense beside her, though his expression remained impassive. She understood that Crawford was offering her exactly what most people would consider the sensible choice: safety, respectability, and freedom from the consequences of her impulsive actions. "And what happens to Thomas?" she called back. Crawford's smile was as cold as a January wind. "The savage gets what he's always had coming. Justice frontier style." The casual way Crawford dismissed Thomas's humanity, reducing him to nothing more than a problem to be eliminated, crystallized something that had been building in Sarah's mind since the moment she'd first seen him on that auction platform. This wasn't really about law and order or public safety or any of the other righteous justifications Crawford used to dress up his actions. This was about power, the power to decide who deserved to live and who deserved to die, who counted as human, and who could be discarded without consequence. "My answer is no," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Crawford's expression darkened. "Then you've chosen your side, and you'll face the consequences along with your pet savage." He raised his hand in a gesture that clearly meant to signal his men to attack, but before the order could be given, Thomas rose from behind the ancient wall like an avenging spirit, materialized from the desert itself. The rifle in his hand spoke once, and Frank Morrison tumbled from his saddle with a cry of surprise and pain. The effect on Crawford's remaining men was immediate and profound. These were not professional soldiers accustomed to facing disciplined resistance. They were opportunists and bullies who'd expected to corner helpless prey, not engage in a genuine firefight with someone who knew how to use the terrain to deadly advantage. "Take cover!" Crawford shouted, but his voice cracked with a note of panic that hadn't been there moments before. The confident predator was discovering that his intended victims had fangs of their own. Sarah found herself moving without conscious thought, the rifle coming up to her shoulder as naturally as if she'd been born to warfare rather than embroidery and household management. Her first shot went wide, chipping stone from the canyon wall, but her second found its mark in the shoulder of one of Crawford's hired guns. The man Henderson, she thought, screamed and clutched at his wounded arm, blood seeping between his fingers as his horse shied and danced beneath him. The sight of her own handiwork should have horrified her, Sarah realized distantly, but instead she felt only grim satisfaction. These men had come here to commit murder, and she felt no qualms about defending herself and Thomas with whatever force proved necessary. "Good shot," Thomas said quietly, reloading his rifle with movements so fluid they seemed almost mechanical. "But save your ammunition. Make every bullet count." The advice proved prophetic as the battle settled into a deadly game of patience and precision. Crawford's men had taken cover behind rocks and scrub brush scattered across the valley floor, but their positions were exposed and uncomfortable. Thomas and Sarah, by contrast, had the advantage of prepared positions among ruins that had been designed with defense in mind by builders who'd understood the realities of survival in hostile country. "We can't stay here forever," Crawford called out during a lull in the shooting. "Sooner or later, you'll run out of ammunition or water or simple endurance. And when you do, we'll be waiting." It was a sound tactical observation, Sarah admitted reluctantly. Their supplies were finite, while Crawford could presumably send for reinforcements if the siege dragged on too long. But Thomas seemed untroubled by their strategic disadvantages. "Crawford," he called back, "do you know the story of the Battle of Canyon de Chelly?" There was a pause before the deputy responded, and Sarah could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Probably nothing," Thomas replied conversationally. "But I was thinking about all those cavalry officers who were absolutely certain they had my people trapped in that canyon, right up until they discovered that the Apache had been using hidden passages to come and go as they pleased for generations." Sarah saw Crawford's head snap up as the implications of Thomas's words sank in. The deputy's eyes began scanning the canyon walls with new intensity, searching for signs of alternate routes that might allow their quarry to escape or, worse yet, circle around to attack from an unexpected direction. "He's bluffing," Henderson said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Crawford replied, "but can you afford to be wrong?" It was masterful psychological warfare, Sarah realized. Thomas hadn't claimed they had an escape route. He'd simply reminded Crawford that this country was full of secrets that white men didn't know and couldn't predict. The seed of doubt, once planted, would grow with every minute that passed without resolution. The sun continued its descent toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. But as shadows began to pool in the valley floor, Sarah understood that time was working against them in ways that had nothing to do with supplies or reinforcements. "They'll rush us when full darkness comes," Thomas said quietly, confirming her fears. Men like Crawford prefer their killing to be done in shadows, where witnesses are scarce and accountability is negotiable. Sarah checked her ammunition for the third time, trying to calculate how long they could hold out against a determined assault. The numbers were not encouraging. "Is there really another way out of here?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes studying the canyon walls as if reading messages written in the stone itself. "There are always ways out," he said finally. "The question is whether we can reach them in time, and whether we're willing to pay the price for using them." Before Sarah could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, the sound of movement echoed from the canyon walls above them. Crawford's men weren't waiting for full darkness after all. They were attempting to gain the high ground, positioning themselves to rain death down into the ruins from above. "Clever," Thomas murmured, tracking the sound of boots on stone with the focused attention of a hunter following prey sign. Crawford's learning. The tactical situation had just become much more complex. If Crawford's men reached positions on the canyon rim, they would have clear shots into the ruins while remaining largely protected from return fire. Sarah and Thomas would be pinned down like animals in a trap, picked off at leisure by enemies they couldn't effectively engage. "We have to stop them," Sarah said. Thomas nodded grimly. "Stay here. Keep the men in the valley honest. I'll deal with the climbers." He began to move toward the base of the canyon wall, but Sarah caught his arm before he could disappear into the gathering shadows. "Thomas," she said urgently, "you don't have to do this alone. We're partners in this, remember?" He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. For just a moment, the war chief facade slipped, revealing the man underneath, someone who'd spent so long fighting alone that he'd almost forgotten what it meant to have someone willing to share the burden. "Sarah," he said quietly, "if something happens to me, don't let them take you alive. Men like Crawford, they have ways of making death seem like mercy." The matter-of-fact way he delivered this advice chilled Sarah to the bone, but she forced herself to nod. She understood that Thomas was sharing the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd seen too much of human cruelty to maintain any illusions about the mercy of enemies. "The same goes for you," she replied. "Promise me." Thomas studied her face in the fading light, perhaps surprised by her practical acceptance of their grim reality. "I promise." He melted into the shadows at the base of the canyon wall, moving with a silence that seemed almost supernatural to Sarah's inexperienced senses. Within moments, he'd vanished completely, leaving her alone among the ancient ruins with only the sound of her own breathing and the distant murmur of voices from Crawford's remaining men. The next few minutes stretched like hours as Sarah waited for some sign of what was happening on the canyon walls above. She could hear occasional sounds, the scrape of boot on stone, a muffled curse, the rattle of loose gravel, but nothing that clearly indicated whether Thomas was succeeding in his mission or walking into a trap. Then suddenly, a scream echoed off the canyon walls, followed by the unmistakable sound of a body falling through space and impacting on stone. Crawford's voice rose in urgent command, but the words were too distorted by echoes for Sarah to make out clearly. More sounds followed the sharp crack of gunfire, shouts of alarm and confusion, the clatter of equipment being dropped or thrown aside in panic. Whatever Thomas was doing up there, it was having a significant impact on Crawford's tactical plans. But the distraction came at a cost. While Sarah's attention was focused on the drama playing out above, she failed to notice movement in the valley itself until Henderson's voice spoke from uncomfortably close range. "Drop the rifle, lady, nice and slow." Sarah turned to find the wounded bounty hunter standing perhaps 20 feet away, his left arm hanging useless at his side, but his right hand steady on the pistol aimed at her chest. His face was pale with blood loss and pain, but his eyes burned with the fevered intensity of a man who'd been hurt and wanted someone to pay for it. "I said drop it," Henderson repeated, his voice pitched higher with stress and adrenaline. Sarah let the rifle slip from her fingers, the weapon clattering against the ancient stones, with a sound that seemed to echo through the ruins like a death knell. Her mind raced through possibilities, but none of them offered much hope. Henderson was too far away for her to reach before he could fire, and too experienced to be distracted by conversation or pleading. "That's better," Henderson said, relaxing slightly now that she was disarmed. "Now step away from that wall where I can see you properly." Sarah moved as directed, emerging from the protective shadows of the ruins into the open ground where moonlight made her clearly visible. Henderson followed her movement with his pistol, maintaining his distance while keeping her covered. "Crawford," he called out, "I got the woman. And that means your pet savage is going to have to choose between saving his own skin and watching her die slow." The words carried clearly in the desert air, bouncing off canyon walls that seemed to amplify their threat until Sarah could hear echoes of Henderson's promise reverberating from multiple directions. There was no way Thomas could have failed. To hear, no possibility that he wouldn't understand exactly what kind of choice was being forced upon him. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Thomas's voice drifted down from somewhere high above, calm and controlled despite the desperate circumstances. "Let her go, Henderson. Your quarrel is with me." Henderson's laugh was harsh and ugly. "My quarrel is with anyone who shoots me, savage. And right now, that includes your lady friend." He raised his voice to make sure Thomas could hear clearly. "Here's how this works. You come down here, throw down your weapons, and submit to proper custody. Do that, and maybe the woman lives long enough to see another sunrise." Sarah felt her stomach clench with a mixture of fear and fury. Henderson was using her as bait, counting on Thomas's sense of honor to override his survival instincts. It was a clever trap, and one that played on everything Sarah had learned about Thomas's character during their brief but intense acquaintance. "Don't do it, Thomas," she called out, hoping her voice would carry to wherever he was concealed. "These men won't honor any bargain they make." Henderson's backhand caught her across the mouth, snapping her head to the side and filling her mouth with the taste of blood. "Shut up, bitch. Nobody asked for your opinion." The casual cruelty of the blow crystallized something that had been building in Sarah's mind throughout this entire ordeal. These men saw her as nothing more than a tool to be used against Thomas, not a person with her own rights and dignity, but simply a means to an end in their campaign of hatred and violence. "You're making a mistake," she said, wiping blood from her split lip. Henderson raised his hand to strike her again, but something in her tone made him pause. "What kind of mistake?" "You think I'm helpless," Sarah said quietly. "You think I'm just some Eastern lady who doesn't know one end of a gun from the other, but you're wrong about that." Even as she spoke, Sarah was calculating distances and angles, remembering lessons her late husband had taught her about firearms and self-defense during their brief marriage. Robert Mitchell had been many things: a dreamer, a gambler, a man whose reach exceeded his grasp. But he'd also been a practical frontiersman who'd understood that survival sometimes depended on a woman's ability to protect herself. "You shot me," Henderson said accusingly, as if this proved some point he was trying to make. "I shot you from 50 yards with a rifle I'd never used before," Sarah corrected. "Do you really think I can't handle one wounded bounty hunter at 20 feet? Henderson's eyes widened slightly as he began to understand that he might have underestimated his captive. But before he could react to this realization, Sarah was already moving. The knife came from her boot, a small blade that Pete Kowalski had included among their supplies, ostensibly for preparing food but sharp enough for other purposes when necessity demanded. Sarah had palmed it while Henderson was distracted by his own threats, and now it flashed across the space between them faster than conscious thought. Henderson screamed and staggered backward, clutching at his gun hand where Sarah's blade had opened a line across his knuckles. His pistol fell from nerveless fingers, and Sarah was on him before he could recover, driving her shoulder into his wounded side and sending both of them tumbling to the ground among the ancient stones. They rolled and struggled in the dust, Henderson's superior size and strength offset by his wounds, and Sarah's desperate fury. She could hear Crawford shouting from somewhere in the valley, could hear the sound of running feet as the deputy's remaining men converged on their location, but all of that seemed distant and unimportant compared to the immediate necessity of survival. Henderson's good hand closed around her throat, squeezing with methodical pressure that sent stars dancing across her vision. Sarah clawed at his face, her fingernails raking bloody furrows across his cheeks, but his grip only tightened. Then, suddenly, the pressure was gone. Henderson's weight lifted from her chest, and Sarah gasped for air as she rolled away from his suddenly motionless form. Thomas stood over the bounty hunter's body, a bloody knife in his hand and death in his dark eyes. "Are you hurt?" he asked, helping Sarah to her feet with his free hand. Sarah touched her throat, feeling the tender spots where Henderson's fingers had pressed. But she was alive and functional. "I'll survive. What about Crawford's other men?" "No longer a concern," Thomas said grimly. "But we need to move, now, before more arrive." As if summoned by his words, the sound of additional horses echoed from the canyon entrance. Crawford had indeed sent for reinforcements, and their brief window of opportunity was closing rapidly. "This way," Thomas said, leading Sarah toward what appeared to be a solid wall of canyon stone. But as they drew closer, she could see that shadows and optical illusion had concealed a narrow crack in the rock, face barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but definitely passable for anyone desperate enough to try. "Your grandmother's secret passage?" Sarah asked. Thomas nodded. "One of them. It leads to another valley, and from there to a dozen other routes through the canyon country. Crawford's men can search for weeks without finding us if we move quickly enough." They squeezed through the narrow opening just as Crawford's voice echoed across the ruins behind them, filled with rage and frustration at finding his carefully laid trap empty except for the bodies of his own men. Sarah allowed herself one brief moment of savage satisfaction at the deputy's obvious fury before focusing on the treacherous footing of the hidden passage. The narrow crack led upward through the heart of the canyon wall, sometimes opening into small chambers where ancient peoples had carved symbols into the stone, sometimes narrowing until Sarah had to turn sideways to continue forward. Thomas moved ahead of her with the confidence of someone following a familiar route, occasionally pausing to help her navigate particularly difficult sections. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they emerged onto a ledge high above the valley floor. Moonlight revealed a landscape of incredible complexity, canyon after canyon stretching away into the distance, a maze of stone passages and hidden valleys that could conceal an army if necessary. "My grandmother was right," Thomas said quietly, surveying the vast wilderness spread out before them. The land does provide for those who know how to read her signs. Sarah looked back toward the valley where they'd made their stand, now invisible behind intervening walls of rock. Crawford's torches were visible as distant points of light, but the deputy and his men might as well have been on another planet for all the threat they now represented. "What happens now?" she asked. Thomas considered the question while studying. "The moonlit landscape. Now we disappear," he said finally. "Become ghosts in the canyon country. People who exist in the spaces between what others know and what they fear." It wasn't the answer Sarah had expected, but as she looked out over the endless expanse of hidden valleys and secret passages, she began to understand that Thomas was offering her something precious, true freedom, the kind that could only be found beyond the reach of laws and social conventions that had never been designed to protect people like them. "And after we disappear?" she asked. Thomas turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his scarred features seemed almost ethereal, as if he were already transforming into one of the spirits his grandmother had spoken of. "After we disappear," he said softly, "we begin. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out."